Year 6, this is our topic book for this term, called Floodland by Marcus Sedgwick. The chapter is called Before. Zoe ran, harder than she had ever run in her life. Her feet pounded through the deserted streets of derelict buildings. Somewhere, not far behind, she could hear the gang coming. It felt as if her heart would burst, but she didn't slow down. She'd been planning to leave the island for a long time, but had been putting it off. It was a big decision to set out to sea in a tiny rowing boat, and now she had no choice. Before, no one had bothered Zoe. Zoe was a loner. Most of the people left on Norwich hung around together in groups, but she preferred to be on her own. It was safer that way, because you never know whom you could trust. Somehow someone had found out about the boat she'd been hiding. A boat was an escape route, a way to get away from Norwich, which got smaller every year. As the sea kept on rising, it didn't matter that there could only be room for 2 people at most in her boat. Others had joined in the chase, and now a mob of about 15 people were hot on her heels. There was only one way out, to get to her boat before they got to her. So she ran, while her body screamed for her to stop. "Get back here!" someone yelled angrily at her, though they couldn't see her. It wasn't far to the little shed where she'd hidden Leica, her boat. A couple more streets of derelict shops to where that was left of the city fell into the sea. If the sea hadn't come, she might have been shopping here herself, with her parents perhaps. From much practice, she squashed through of her parents as soon as it started, and her thoughts were gone. She kept running. Just before she rounded a corner, she heard more shouts from behind. They had seen her. "There, come on," shouted another voice, "get her!" Scared, she made the corner, but her feet slipped from under her as the wet ground. She went sprawling and slid clumsily into the mud. She started to panic badly and made a mess of getting up again. She had dropped her back as she fell, and her pack with it, but there was no time to pick it up. The sound of running feet came closer. Another 2 seconds and they would be around the corner. She got up and practically threw herself over the wall. She landed awkwardly, but she won a little more time. She was in a graveyard. It led away down a hill to where a small brick shed stood near the water's edge. Once it contained all the equipment for looking after the graveyard, but now it contained Zoe's boat. The previous night she'd rowed around from the warehouse where she'd found the boat and fixed it. The old building had been unsafe when she discovered it and had been getting worse. She decided to find a new place to keep her boat, and the shed, well, it seemed ideal. In the dark, she had dragged the boat to the shore distance from the water to the shed. It had been very hard work. At night, she hadn't noticed the deep ruts the boat's keel had made in the sodden grass. In daylight, even in her mad rush, they were pretty obvious. She would be lucky if no one had already found it. "Leica," she panted as she opened the door. "Please be here, Leica." It was all right. The boat was still there waiting for her. Pulling it across the grass and then into the water, she dared to look behind her for the first time. Her stomach twisted with fear. The gang was storming down the hill, weaving in and out of the crumbling gravestones. Zoe moved faster. She clambered aboard and put the oars out, then started to pull. They were at the water now, and though 1 or 2 had stopped, the rest came splashing madly after her. "Take me with you! Come back, we won't hurt you, just take us with you!" Zoe could see their eyes clearly. She saw fear, but she couldn't trust them. Since she'd lost her parents, she made it a rule. Don't trust anyone. Zoe had heard people say they'd lost someone. What they really meant was that they had died. In Zoe's case, lost meant exactly that. It was still unbelievable and so stupid. She looked at the crowd in the water again. If she went back, there'd be a fight over her boat, and she wouldn't get a look in. She rowed on, pulling harder, even though she was safely away. Slowly she watched as the people dragged themselves out of the water and waded back to the shore. Natasha was there too. That hurt most of all. Natasha was the closest thing she had to a friend, and Zoe used to see her when the supply ships came, before they stopped coming. After that, she saw her sometimes at the allotments, when she went to put some work in to earn food. They would only have a little chat, but it was enough to keep Zoe from cracking up. But now the allotments had sunk into chaos too. Zoe suddenly remembered their conversation the last time she'd met her. She'd been about to tell Natasha about her boat and her plans to escape, but had decided not to. Maybe Natasha had just guessed. Had something Zoe said let slip? It It didn't matter now. The crowd stood quietly, watching her as she rode away. Zoe didn't feel scared of them anymore. Sorry, she said to herself quietly. She began to cry, but that didn't stop her rowing. Her uncut hair fell across her eyes, but she didn't stop to push it away. Still she rowed on, her thin, hunched frame working the oars until finally she had to pause for breath. Feeling around in her pocket, she fished out her compass. It was the last thing she owned that had belonged to her parents. For that reason, she'd kept it in her pocket. If she hadn't, she'd have lost it when she dropped her pack. It was a little dented, remember that leap over the cemetery wall? But it was still working. She pointed herself southwest and rowed. She couldn't remember the name of the place the supply ship used to come from, but she knew that big bit of Britain was somewhere in that direction. She was rowing away from all she'd ever known. It was a strange thing. Before the previous night, she had only ever pretended to row. Her dad had taught her in the same methodical way he did everything. You'll need to know how to do this one day, he told her. He taught her how to use the compass, as well as lots of other stuff about survival, just in case the time came when she was on her own. And so every now and then, when they weren't busy just trying to get by, they'd sit in an old bathtub and pretend to row. Even though it had seemed like a game to Zoe at the time, he'd made sure she was doing it the proper way. And she knew how to do it. The only thing that surprised her was how hard it was to pull the oars through the water. Why don't you look what you're doing? She'd asked her dad. When you're rowing, you mean? He asked. Yes. Why do you sit looking backwards? Just the way it's done, he said. You couldn't row half as well facing forwards. It had always seemed strange to her, but now it was even worse. There before her was Norwich, getting smaller and smaller with every stroke. She was heading into the unknown without even looking where she was going. She rowed and rowed until her small supply of food was gone. She had put the compass on the floor of the boat in front of her, and every few seconds she checked her direction against it. There was no sign of land now, and a creeping fear began to seep into her. She looked at the compass almost every stroke, and it was her only chance now. Like magic, its tiny hands kept pointing in the same direction. It knew where she was going, even if she didn't have a clue. She lost all sense of time. The sun was somewhere way overhead and beat at the back of her neck, making her feel a bit dizzy. She pushed her hair out of her eyes, set the sea wind blew it back against her face. She felt faint. She was in trouble. She had just enough awareness to pull in her oars, and then she slumped over them. In her stupor, she relayed the nightmare where she had lost her parents. I'll leave the rest till next week.